Hi, I'm Scott. Today on Synth Stuff, we're going to be talking about power. Powering your synths, filters, internal versus external power supplies, and more. Coming up next. So this is a question I seem to get all the time, and I don't really know why it's such a popular question, but well, I'll go ahead and address it. I get asked, what do I use for filtering power to all my synthesizers? A lot of people say they use power filters. You know, they can get expensive power filters, like a Furman power filter that goes into your rack. Some people just use power strips. Some people use nothing at all. Why do we have to filter power? Well, power leaving the generating station may be nice and clean once it leaves the station, but things can happen on the way in between there and our synthesizers. Most importantly is the power in my house is connected to the power in everybody else's house down the line. If somebody in a house nearby to me does something that causes a big short or maybe a backfeed or something onto the power grid, that's going to affect all the stuff in my house. If somebody drives a car into a telephone pole and two wires touch that aren't supposed to touch, and a high amount of energy or a voltage gets put into a wire that's not supposed to have it, that can end up coming into your house, and that's called a voltage surge. So you can have a voltage surge, a voltage sag, also known as a brownout. You can have transients, which are spikes. All of that stuff can come in on your power into your house. And everything in your house has to be able to accept that power and continue operating. So let's say we have a surge comes into our house, and instead of 120 volts, it surges up to 140. Well, a lot of your sensitive electronics are not going to like that. If you buy a power strip that has a surge suppressor in it, it has something called a varistor in there. And a varistor is rated for a certain voltage. So let's say we had a 130 volt varistor in there. As soon as the power goes up above 130, it cuts it off, and no additional voltage above 130 is allowed to get through. It clamps it down and basically shorts it out. So where does that power go? Well, it eats it up and disperses heat in the varistor itself. So every time your varistor or your surge suppressor absorbs a surge like that, it actually gets destroyed just a little bit. So if you have a power strip that has a surge suppressor and it's been plugged in for a number of years, chances are it's no good anymore. It's not doing anything for you. Surge suppressors are a good protection against overvoltage surges, particularly if they're transient in nature. If you have just a quick spike, it will cut that off and not let that quick spike through. If you have voltage that comes into your house and it goes up to 150 volts and stays there for a couple of minutes, no surge suppressor is going to help you. They're just going to burn up. Not physically burn up, but they will get used up and just let through the full voltage to whatever is plugged into them. You can also get whole home surge suppressors, which is basically a box full of big varistors that plugs into your electrical panel and does the same thing, but for your entire house instead of just whatever's plugged into the surge suppressor strip. And what about lightning? So lightning is a big surge. If lightning hits far away from you, you can get a transient surge, and for that, a surge suppressor is perfectly valid protection for your delicate electronics. If lightning hits your house or the house next to you or the tree in your backyard, there is no device that is going to protect your electronics. Lightning bolt is millions of volts, millions of amps. It's just so much power that it will just completely overwhelm anything that's plugged into anything in the near vicinity. Even just a lightning strike nearby can induce a massive amount of power in the wiring in your home just because it's close to it. The only way you can really protect your sensitive electronics from a lightning strike is to unplug it from the wall so it's not even plugged into anything. And that means the synthesizer is not plugged into the wall. It's also not plugged into the USB going into a computer, which is plugged into a wall, because lightning will travel through a USB cable or an audio cable or any other kind of cable. So if you have a synthesizer that is really valuable, just unplug it from everything and set it up against the wall. Now it's going to be safe from lightning or anything else. Okay, what do I use? I actually use UPSs. Now there's two types of UPSs. There's an online and an offline. Online UPSs is what I use. They're extremely expensive. I have them simply because I was able to get them through where I worked. The difference between the two is that an online UPS, the load or your synthesizers are being powered by the inverter inside the UPS and running off the battery of the UPS at all times. So there is no connection to the outside world between my synthesizers and the electric power coming in. That is to say, my synthesizers are running off the UPS, off battery on the UPS all the time. Incoming power is used only to charge the batteries in the UPS. So the batteries maintain their charge because there is power coming in, but if that power goes away, no problem because the battery is already running the synthesizers. That way there's a physical disconnect between the incoming and the outgoing power. You have much better isolation, much better protection. Again, online UPS is not cheap, so if you are going to go that route, it might be feasible for a studio where you have perhaps millions of dollars worth of equipment, and spending $5,000, $10,000 on an online UPS system is not unheard of. For most home studios, it's not really an option, and like I said, I only have them here because I was able to get them at extremely low cost because of a place I was doing work for. Most UPSs, like the ones you'll find on Amazon, I like the CyberPower UPSs on Amazon. I've used and recommended those for years. I'll put a link to those in the description below. Those UPSs are different in that the outside power coming from the utility is feeding through the UPS, directly through the UPS, into your devices. Now there are surge suppressors in the UPSs, so if there is a surge, it's going to absorb that because it has a varistor bank in it. And what happens if something happens to the power? If the power goes too high, goes too low, turns off entirely, well, the UPS has a relay in there that very quickly switches off, turns off the outside power, and turns on the inside power. So now the battery through an inverter is powering your device. So the UPS is now running your device. The outside power is completely disconnected. It monitors the outside power and waits till it comes back to normal, and then it reconnects automatically. So that's your typical UPS operation. You should note that if you are going to use the UPS to protect your equipment, that you must get a true sine output UPS, not a modified sine. Modified sine output UPSs put a stepped output like this that has a lot of harmonics in it, and you don't want that going into delicate electronics or specialty audio gear. I like having UPSs on synthesizers, and one of the main reasons for that is another question that I got on another video is, do I leave all my synthesizers turned on all the time, or do I turn them off? And if so, how do I turn them off? Do I have switches on power bars, or how do I do it? Obviously, most of my synthesizers are covered up most of the time because to keep the dust off. So they're not on. I only typically turn on the synthesizers that I'm actually using, or if I'm shooting a video, I'll go ahead and I'll uncover everything and turn them all on so we have lots of flashing lights to look at. That said, I don't turn them off by using the power bar. I use the individual power switches on each synthesizer, and let me tell you why. On old analog synths like the SH-101 or the Poly 6 or the Juno 106 or any other analog synthesizer, there is no electronic memory in there. There's no computers. They don't care if the power comes and goes. If you turn it off, it turns off. If you turn it on, it turns back on. It's an analog device, just like a light bulb. It couldn't care less. Digital synthesizers like this are something different entirely because you could potentially be writing to volatile memory. Now, admittedly, the chances of that happening in one of these synthesizers is very, very low. Most of these digital synthesizers only write to memory when you actually tell it to store something. For the most part, that we know about. That said, if you are writing to memory and the power goes out in a digital synthesizer, there's a very real possibility that you have just bricked or destroyed that synthesizer, because when you're writing to memory, flash memory, so let's say you're changing the name of a patch in flash memory, it doesn't just change those 8 characters that you changed the name of. It actually flash memory works in blocks. So it takes a huge block of memory, reads it out, makes that change in the part of the block that contains the name, and then it writes that huge block of memory back into the flash RAM. If something happens during the writing of that block, it can corrupt that memory, and now it can't read it. The synthesizer could end up corrupting its patch memory, or worse, could end up corrupting its actual firmware itself, and it now won't even boot up. There are some synthesizers like the Montage, the Phantom, I believe the System 8 as well, that when you turn them off, it doesn't actually turn off. You turn the power switch off and the computer says, oh, I'm being turned off, and it makes sure that it's not doing anything, and then it shuts itself off. The X32 mixer I have actually has a mode where you can go into the setup and say power off, and that will ensure that there is no flash memory being written at that point, so you can safely turn it off without corrupting the memory. So that's the answer for that. I don't leave them on all the time. I turn on only the ones I need. Once I'm finished working with individual synthesizers for the day, I will turn them off. The last power-related question I got was, why do some synthesizers have a brick like this? And then some of them have a plug that you can plug right in. Like the Montage and the Summit, there's just an IEC plug that you just plug right into the back of the synthesizer. However, the System 8 and many of the digital synths you buy today come with a power brick or a wall wart or something like this. This is from the Phantom 06, that you plug this into the wall, and it's got the power supply here, and this plugs into the back of the synthesizer. So why use this instead of putting a power supply inside the synthesizer like this? Basically, money. If you look at the Modi X, it has an external power supply like this, but the Montage, which is the flagship version of the Modi X, has an internal power supply. Why do that? Is it more expensive to put a power supply inside the thing? Yes and no. The components might be cheaper to install inside. However, there is another cost to putting a power supply inside a synthesizer that most people don't know about. And here's the reason for that. If we look at the power supply on this Roland brick here, we can see all kinds of certifications. ULCC, there's a FCC, you might see CSA, TUV. So in another life, many years ago, I worked for a consulting agency that did testing for electronic devices to get these certifications. These are from certification agencies for different countries. CSA is Canada, UL is Underwriters Laboratory here in the US, TUV is some German words that I don't remember what they mean. But there are different testing agencies for different countries. Many agencies, particularly CSA and UL, will accept each other's certifications. What is involved in getting these things certified? Basically, we blow them up. We blow them up real good. And it was actually a fun job. So what we would do is we would simulate a car hitting a telephone pole and a 10,000 volt line falling across the input here. So we would inject 10,000 volts into these things. And basically they had to accept that 10,000 volts and not explode, not catch fire, not put 10,000 volts out the output. If it had vents, it's not allowed to spurt flame out onto whatever it's sitting on, because obviously we did a lot of telephone and modem testing. If power accidentally got put in your telephone lines, you don't want every house on the block catching fire because the phone spurted flame out the bottom onto whatever they were sitting on. So that was the type of testing I did. Testing to certify something like this is fairly simple because it's just a monolithic block. There's no vents. It's fairly small, has a single purpose. These are relatively inexpensive to certify. Plus, once you've certified this power supply once, you can use it in all kinds of different products. And Roland, of course, is not in the business of making power supplies. They don't make this power supply. They buy it from a vendor who makes it for them, and their vendor gets the certification done. So Roland buys these already made from their vendor with the certifications in place, and you're good to go. I will make a note that a lot of the power supplies you buy online on Amazon from China, no-name China things, will have fraudulent certifications on it. You'll find all kinds of stuff like that sold on Amazon. Many Chinese products are sold with fraudulent certifications. They've not had testing. You can look up on the actual UL and CSA websites, and if you look up the devices, they aren't listed, they aren't there. It's because the certification was never done. But in order to sell them legally, they have to be certified. So the Chinese companies will just print the certification mark on there, which is illegal, but they still do it, and nobody does anything about it. So the Montage has the power supply inside it. Why wouldn't they do that for the Modi X? Just put it inside there and plug in right into the back of the synthesizer. Again, the reason is cost, because now that the power supply is inside the case of the synthesizer, the entire synthesizer has to pass UL testing. If the synthesizer has no high voltage going into it, so it only has the low voltage coming out of this jack, 9 volts or 12 volts or whatever, no safety testing is required on the synthesizer itself. But if it has 110 or 120 volt input on the back, now this has to go through all kinds of extremely expensive and destructive testing. They have to submit conforming samples for testing, and because of that, the case itself has to be designed differently. The materials used have to be different in order for it to be able to pass that testing. And that's expensive to do. Not only that, every time a new version of the same synthesizer comes out where they've made changes to it, it has to go through the testing from scratch all over again. Whereas if they're just using a simple little power supply, they can make all the changes they want to the synthesizer without having to resubmit it for testing. So that's why nowadays only the higher end synthesizers that you'll see actually have that internal power supply. The ones that you'll see that typically are going to be used by professionals on stage or in the studio, like the Montage, like the Summit, like the Phantom. I hope that answers all of your power-related questions. I know I got quite a few of them recently, so I thought I would just condense them all into a single video talking all about power. And I'm going to tack on one more question, a little bit odd question, I thought, but I thought it deserved an answer. I had somebody who had been watching my synth videos and also went and listened to some of the songs, some of the music that I post on my channel here, and he said, I'd be really interested to know what your musical influences are, and where did you come from? What music do you love, and what did you come up loving? And I thought, well, I don't know why he cares, but I'll tell you. I actually came up as a kid in the 70s listening to classical music. Literally, I would sit at home, I'd come home from school, I put a set of headphones on, tuned to the classical FM station, and listened to classical music as I did my homework. In the late 70s, I was tuning around on the radio just for fun, and I heard this song that I thought, it has the most strange sounds in it, and I didn't understand what it was, but I loved it because it was something new that I'd never heard before. And that song, of course, was Cars by Gary Newman. And what I was hearing was synthesizers. So that kind of was my introduction to the world of electronic music. From then I went, ELO was a huge influence because it had both the strings and the classical orchestral instruments that I loved from classical music, but also they started using keyboards and synthesizers in the music as well. So it was kind of like a perfect bridge for me. Kraftwerk. The first time I heard Kraftwerk, it just blew my mind because it was just all electronic. It was like computerized music, but it had soul to it. So, I mean, Kraftwerk was just a huge influence. And then because I was growing up in Toronto, I discovered CFNY, a radio station that played all the music listened to by the people, weird people with purple hair, and they played a lot of British music, new wave music, and because of that, and I actually ended up working for that station a number of years later, but because of them, I got introduced to a huge array of music. I mean, they were the first to play Duran Duran. I mean, I heard the first Duran Duran album on there. I went and saw Duran Duran play, I think it was 1983, I want to say. It was in Toronto, they actually filmed the Reflex video at the concert at which I was at. Depeche Mode, huge influence on me. Huge. I just loved everything Depeche Mode did. Then Pet Shop Boys came along. I don't think Pet Shop Boys have ever put out anything that I didn't absolutely love. I've loved Pet Shop Boys since the very early days of since West End Girls and the original Pet Shop Boys. They actually put out a single called Pet Shop Boys, and okay, I didn't love that. It was horrendous, but I have it. I have the 12-inch single, and but I think West End Girls or Opportunities, one of those was probably what got me into Pet Shop Boys, and all the way through their dance and trance and house stages and everything they've done, I've pretty much loved. I mean, there's so many bands that were influences. It's really tough for me to come up with just a few. I'll tell you one that I'm actually going to be seeing next month for the first time ever is Information Society, another band that everything they've put out ever I've always loved. Most people say Information Society and they're like, oh yeah, what's on your mind? They're a one-hit wonder. No, they were not a one-hit wonder, and they've continued to put out fantastic albums. If you actually do have a love of electronic music, I suggest you hunt down every Information Society album ever produced because they're all just fantastic. And they have a new one out. It's called Oddfellows, which is kind of a combination of some new stuff as well as some old stuff that never made it onto albums back in the day, and you can really hear the difference between them. The person that asked me that question also asked what my favorite group would be, and if I had to pick one favorite group, it's going to be Underworld. Underworld just to me is everything about music that I love. I could just sit and listen to Underworld for hours and hours and hours. Now, I loved Underworld before they were Underworld. Back in the 80s, they were actually called Freur. And I know everybody say Freur, but Freur, it's F-R-E-U-R. Their most famous song was Doot Doot, but they also had Riders in the Night. And you can hear the spawning of Underworld in the Freur sound, and of course then they Carl and Rick kind of moved into the world of electronic dance and EDM, and Underworld just became a huge thing. I have some times in my life where Underworld was the soundtrack to my life, and everything I was doing, I had Underworld playing. I've done an Underworld cover before. I don't know if I did it justice, but I do at times think, how would Carl be doing this? And how would Rick be arranging this? And so that is definitely playing into my mind when I'm actually composing and mixing and creating music, is I want it at times to sound Underworld-ish. When Underworld came out with the Drift project in 2020, I think is one of the most innovative and amazing things they've ever done, any band has ever done. They put out a new track every week for a year, for an entire year. They just cranked out music one week after another, after another, after another. Some of the tracks were brand new. A lot of the tracks were brand new. Sometimes they were just rare, old live tracks from years ago. Like the Grateful Dead, a lot of the Underworld live performances have been recorded and shared and traded across the internet, so I've got tons of those. If you can still find it, I don't know if it's still for sale, but you can actually buy that Drift compilation as a box set, and it's just the most fantastic compilation of electronic music I have ever heard. If you have ever heard Underworld and you thought, I like this, go out, do yourself a favor, buy Drift. Get the box set of Drift. You'll spend the next several weeks listening to it and hopefully loving Underworld as much as I have. Okay, enough talking about Underworld. I hope I haven't bored you, and I'm sure everyone's tuned out by now talking about my musical influences and likes, but I hope you got some information that you can use about power. And if you did find this of any use whatsoever, please do click subscribe, click like, click the little bell. You know the deal. Leave a comment below if you have any comments. Tell me what you like to listen to. What are your influences? What do you think of Underworld? All right. That's it for another week. I'm gone next week, so no video, but we'll see you when I get back. Thanks for watching.